When was the last time you got out of your comfort zone? Played something you otherwise wouldn't? If you're anything like me, it's not because you particularly hate those types of games, you just have plenty to play already. Well, in the VR space, there's a type of game where you're piloting these giant monstrosities. Whether it be this giant octopus wreaking havoc, solving puzzles, or something smaller like piloting a strange pirate doll man thing. Yes, again, it's not that these games are particularly bad, it's just that I really know what I like and there's already so much to play. But every now and again, you're given an opportunity to get out of your comfort zone, and that appeared to me a couple weeks back. You see, one of my viewers is apparently working on a VR game and asked me if I cared to play it. Funnily enough, it was one of these pilot a monstrosity kind of games. But this time around, you're piloting this legally distinct big lizard and fighting this legally distinct gigantic robo-mech thing. When I first jumped in, I was greeted by this fun splash art and a laboratory to explore. And also the weirdest ski movement set by default. Eesh. But as I made my way throughout the lab, I started to notice how much attention to detail there was here. Even something as simple as bringing food to your mouth and hearing that satisfying chomp was present, and oh boy, hits so hard every time I experience it in VR. Don't know why it's so satisfying, and yet so few VR games choose to do it. Speaking of details, something that is next level cute that I found was the tiny little furniture that exists within the buildings that you're gonna eventually destroy, that we'll talk about a little later. As I enter the second room, you are greeted by this towering lizard surrounded by this powerful thick sludge. Remind me of Kim Possible vibe. Not sure if that sticks for anyone else, but yeah. At this point, it's a pretty good time to mention just how good this game looks. You see, in VR, we are constantly pulled in two very different directions. One direction is the brutal, hellish standalone graphics, or the most realistic of realistic gun graphics you have ever seen. But to me and many others, the best graphics will always be stylized graphics that also possess a good bit of detail. Think something like Bone Lab or Blade and Sorcery. Cartoony in some ways, but also detailed in others. And usually games that lean into the more stylized direction know how to perfectly leverage things like color, and oh boy does this game know how to do exactly that. Anyways, after wreaking havoc all over the lab, I finally arrived at a rather bare bones starting screen, which is fine because this game is still pretty early into early access, so the whole let them cook sentiment should be present throughout this entire video. But after messing around a little bit, I finally made my way into the meat and potatoes of what this game really is. A kind of Power Rangers slash Godzilla sandbox sim. Say that 10 times fast. And the first thing that stood out to me in a very big way was just how clean the destructible environments were. Speaking of which, small rant, what the hell happened to these kinds of games? You guys remember like games like Red Faction, Gorilla? Oh my god, I would pay full price for 3 of those games right now, along with an Overlord 4 and a Darkness 3, but I digress. It's really good to see the destructive environments making a comeback. I digress. After thoroughly destroying the housing market, honestly kind of therapeutic, we finally got to the I mean, legally distinct mech to spawn in and, of course, throw down. At this point, let's talk about the combat as a whole. First of all, it's really badass to see how complex the combat can be. From the ability to block a right hook, to enemies' armor plates being destructible, from also the pure variety of enemy types we have to fight against. From shielded enemies to gun-type enemies. And for the gun-type enemies to be working as well as it has been is an incredible feat, don't get me wrong. But I will say I encountered 2 main problems, and please remember this is all early access footage, and things could very well be fixed or adjusted by the time the game fully releases. The first problem I encountered is something I've seen a lot in other VR games, which, to put it simply, can be summed up by one statement that most people can agree with. In VR, you should always reward and validate the player's effort. If you block an enemy's punch and then quickly punch them in, let's say, the head, but then nothing happens or you do like no damage, you tend to feel pretty cheated. The sentiment being, why did I do all that for nothing? It's not the same as hitting a button on a controller or hitting a key. It hurts big time and fills you with frustration very, very quickly. This can be made more clear if you think about how every one of our brains are problem-solving machines looking for any way to win or improve. And if you try things again and again and don't get a satisfying result, then you are doomed to be so frustrated, especially if you're trying things that otherwise should have some effect. Or your brain finds the next best thing, which is just to use whatever is a satisfying solution to the problem at hand. For an example, after landing like 7 punches that didn't really seem to land, I eventually started looking for a way to win or something that would be worth the physical effort I was continuing to dump in, which in this case happened to be picking up a car car and just throwing it at a mech, or just using the mech's body itself as a weapon. And don't get me wrong, the physics and the destructible objects around us definitely make things that hit feel really satisfying. But the question still remains, how do we validate a player that wants to do more, as well as empower their problem-solving brain? Well, I came up with 2 solutions, albeit they may not be perfect. Here's what I got. The first thing I would love to see in really any VR game, especially this one, is a glowing hit marker or an orb that appears somewhere on the mech's body, acting as a bonus damage when you're able to land a punch near that said hit marker or orb. Especially with how the combat works, to me it would just make it so that any false punch that never really landed or bugged out would have just been bonus anyway. The main hits you're striving for are those critical punches wherever the armor is quote-unquote weakest. And ultimately you can throw some false punches in the face and that might do damage or it might not, but it's fine because that's not the thing that you're constantly hunting for. Ideally, you could focus on blocking an enemy's punch and then throwing another at their head whilst your problem-solving brain is waiting for the critical orb to appear and reward a quick jab that is also accurate. And that would really validate your effort, especially if that time interval of that critical orb appearing was pretty small, so you need to seize the day, as it were. And if you wanted to increase the difficulty later down the line, you could just increase how fast the crit spot jumps to other locations on the mech's body. This would give your players something satisfying to look for that could also result in massive damage, but also acts as a clearly understandable mechanic that when you increase the difficulty later down the line, that would make logical sense about why it's getting harder as you go into deeper levels. And the aforementioned solution, speed up, prepare more, so on and so forth. Now, if we contrast all that with the shield enemies or the gun enemies, it's not quite as clear on how to handle them at all. Which brings me to my hopeful second solution. This game is in early access, so possibly something they're planning on adding, but it'd be really nice to have some text pop up and tell you how to deal with certain enemy types, or just give you prompts on something fun that you could do to them. For example, if there was an objective that popped up on your screen that said, build up strength by dealing damage, and then use that strength by grabbing one of the mechs and hurl them into a skyscraper, dealing massive damage to not only the mech, but the surrounding area. Again, this could still lean into the difficulty metric, but also validate how certain mechanics work, and the player would intuitively know that by dealing damage makes bigger things happen, as well as leads them to the funnest aspects of this game where it has the strongest foot to stand on, which is its destructible environment. Again, throwing an enemy through a skyscraper hits beautifully. Lots of words. So those are my 2 solutions. Maybe they're not good enough, maybe the intricacies of game development would make that near impossible, especially for the size of this team. Totally valid answers. If the devs are saying that right now, totally get ya. Those are just the ones that came into my head that I've been hoping to see in other VR games for a while now. Alas, let's move on to the second problem I faced, and that problem is the idea of save the best for last. Also a lingering feeling of powerlessness. I cannot describe how warped and bad this idea is, especially nowadays in the endless content cycle of the battle for your attention. But this is made even worse by the extremely high buy-in of having to burn like 80 calories, i.e. move around and exert yourself exponentially in VR, resulting in you burning like 8,000 calories just to get the new weapon? This can be made a little bit more clear if you look at any of the most successful VR games like Bone Lab or Blade and Sorcery. Bone Lab immediately gives you a handgun and an assault rifle, as well as a plethora of other tools. The point I'm trying to make is that a lot of these games lead with their strongest leg to stand on, only saving like 2 or 3 things for later in the game. Now perhaps this is a little bit unfair with the size of Stress Level Zero's team, as well as their backing and all those things, but my problem isn't really about the game so much as it's just the rate in which you get weapons is really slow. And it kind of feels like you have to play like 5 hours just to get some of the coolest parts of the game when other games aren't asking you to do that, you know? But at this point, I hope you'll allow me to slow down and make something a little clear. To tell you the truth, I don't really know what the designer's goal is here, and perhaps that's incredibly selfish for me to not consider. I don't expect every game to be made for me, but I think with a few changes, this game could really hook a lot of people. But perhaps that wouldn't be the game they maybe want to create? But with all that being said, let me ask you, if you had to pick between these 2 options, option 1, where you play a game where you are given the best and funnest tools / upgrades right at the offset and feel overwhelmingly powerful, ragdolling these gigantic mechs into giant skyscrapers, feeling like an absolute beast. And then as you progress, new fun ways to tear enemies and mechs apart unlocks. But as you increase the world's level, it responds to your ever-increasing destruction. And no surprise, enemies start getting harder and stronger. But so do you. But ultimately, you always feel like the biggest beast in the animal kingdom. Or, option 2, you start off as a little lizard who has to box and block enemies' punches and wait, a lot of waiting for them to attack you, and then for you to be able to attack them, and so on and so forth. And then you defeat them, doing that a couple more times, to then get a small bit of money to then be able to buy one upgrade. And you're excited to use your brand new upgrade, only to then load into a level to be met with a brand new enemy type, in which you have no way to handle, who has a shield, or a gun, that makes your immediate upgrade feel brutally weak in comparison to the new enemy type. Don't get me wrong, the option 2 is for a person who maybe wants a really slow and difficult kind of experience, which is a player base for sure. I just feel like most people want to feel empowered, at least at the offset, you know? To be shown what the best and most unique aspects of your game are without any restrictions and just having a whole mess of a lot of fun, feeling empowered to the 9 and all that. But even the mightiest of lizard gods want to feel mortal again, seeking some sort of challenge. But said challenge should always meet the player's expectation. For an example, if you had to face an enemy with a gun who started to shoot at you, and you didn't have any skill that could counter that in any way, you'd probably be like, what the fuck am I supposed to do here? Do I just weirdly strafe and try to MacGyver until I can get near him and then punch him a bunch as he's shooting me in the chest? Is there like a stun effect when I punch him? What's going on? However, if we contrast that with the game giving you, let's say, a lizard dash, that would work beautifully closing the distance, and if we make it even better that when you finally do close the distance, you can tear away that enemy's gun and bash it into him or the enemy next to him, having an impromptu steel bat would just make all the sense in the world, right? You don't need any explanation on why the game wants you to do what you do when it all just kind of makes sense. Contrast that with an enemy being plopped right in front of you and you're like, I guess I could shoot you with the upgraded gun I got, but it's got to charge up and I'm just supposed to hide behind a building maybe? Okay, is this the funnest gameplay that we could have here? It just seems a little odd. Again, I'm not sure what the designer's goals are here. Maybe they really want to make a challenging kind of rock'em sock'em Godzilla versus mech game. In that case, by all means, do you. But I think if they made you feel just a little bit more powerful within the first couple levels, and maybe even gave you some of the best upgrades sooner and saved only a handful for later in the game, then that would have a higher chance of hooking players at the offset much, much faster. And if they wanted to add difficulty later on, then by all means, that'd be great. But I do think you need to earn that difficulty. First by meeting the player's expectations and rewarding their effort every step of the way. But again, it all depends on what the team really wants to do. This is just some little old Canadian in the middle of nowhere's 2 cents. Okay, that was a lot. And to be clear, I really did enjoy playing, but I can also say power fisting my supercharged lizard boy's fist into a mech's face only to have it do nothing left me wanting just a little bit more power. But for me at least, I think this game would really connect with people if they let you be a little bit of an overcharged freak, at least at the beginning. Again, grabbing those Power Ranger rejects and tearing them apart, or throwing them through a fucking skyscraper would be next level sick. Then increasing the difficulty in the ways that would meet players' expectations in later levels. But other than all that, this game's destructive gameplay and surprising visuals left me pretty happy and surprised. And with how many features the game already has in the game, with all the different mechs and the aforementioned attention to detail, I have a good bit of faith for the points of friction that I think will be ironed out by the time this game fully releases. And when this game releases in the future, I'll be sure to talk your ear off when that date comes. To the dev team and the viewer who reached out, I am extremely grateful to be able to experience something that looked like a lot of people put a whole lot of care and consideration into it. So again, thank you. And I can't wait to see what this game blossoms into in the coming months. Also, one last side note, if this game happened to catch your eye at some point in this video, you can always wishlist it on Steam if you're interested. I'll be keeping my eye on it for sure, like I mentioned. Also, if it's not too much trouble, how would you solve some of the problems I mentioned? These problems I've seen a lot of VR games face. Again, regardless, let me know what you guys would do as far as solving those kinds of problems. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you kindly for your time. My name is GRINN. I hope I can see you again and love ya.